We will start in a bit
Okay. So
because others will join now. So, if we have some technical issues, then there's the AV team who will assist basically. Yesterday we had one where there was some issue, but yeah.
thanks for the warning, and thanks in advance to the AV team for their support. Um, just wanted to confirm how much time I have to speak. We will have a Q&A, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So roughly around 45 minutes. Is that okay? For 45 minutes?
So I planned for about half an hour, but
Okay,
yeah,
so
I mean, there's always a
yeah,
tendency
40
to go
minutes.
over, right?
Yeah.
So
Okay.
yeah, I'll keep that in mind. Thanks.
Okay, then yeah, 40 minutes or so. We-
Okay, sounds good.
We'll start in like, I don't know, 5 minutes. So there's a little bit of time, 3, 4 minutes.
So thanks, Nan.
In my video, okay.
Ah, there you are. Yes. Hi. How many participants are we expecting? Do we have an idea of how many registered? You're on mute.
AV team is going to probably be able to say, but I don't know actually. Maybe
Okay.
if,
No, but
if
just wanted to also understand students will be there, right? Because
yeah.
I
So
should
also this
then
is
perhaps.
yeah, yeah. You should I think address to students as well because I mean even
Mhm.
however many join right now, this is will also get recorded and if we have your permission to do so and
Okay. Sure.
yeah and we shall put it up on the channel uh, in our channel. So that's why it will go to
Okay.
the students.
Sounds good. Good to know.
Mhm. Rethinking. I welcome everyone to this webinar on rethinking mobility and development with Dr. Neha Wadhawan. So we are hosting this from Ideas at OK Jindal University. We are has have just launched our MSc in Development Practice program, which is a non-residential program running from the Delhi facility of Jindal. And we have an online master's in development studies as well, which will run from December. So, as part of it, we are interacting with various scholars, experts in their field, uh, to talk about what would development, the entire question of development with its different dimensions mean today, what kind of rethinking is required, uh, because the field is changing, the world is in a flux, and we are trying to handle this question when trying to teach it, trying to research it in a difficult time and in a complex time. And so today we are glad that we are having this interaction with Dr. Neha Wadhawan. She is a research and policy expert on social reproduction, migration, on labor and gender questions in general. And we're especially happy because she is in both the has been both in the teaching as well as in research field and on in the policy domain. So she has worked with the ILO for the last 8 years or so. And before that, also, she has worked with various UN agencies. Before that, she is taught in development studies in Ambedkar University, Delhi, for about 3 years. So she brings both the components that we would ideally like in a practice kind of a program also, and hence it's not just a general webinar where that we are doing, but it's also we are thinking it in terms of a dialogue with people who are trying to think what kind of questions on development do we need to think through, including like with the faculty who will be teaching it, because we are in the stage of ideating about how a program like this would look like. What Dr. Neha Wadhawan has done is also she has looked at a lot of structural questions and patterns while dealing with her concerns, as well as she has a lot of ethnographic as well as grounded insights for a lot many years. I personally have learned a lot from her as well. And from a South Asia perspective, and not just an Indian perspective, but also she has worked on Nepal and in Sri Lanka on domestic workers and their migration patterns, and then how policy blindsides happen, and that she has worked out a lot. How certain policies, rather than visibilizing, have invisibilized maybe a section, as well as whole parts of especially when talking about social reproduction. So she has done her PhD from JNU and has published on these questions a lot, including with lastly with ILO a number of papers with Alpashaj and Slurch and so on. So I will not go into too much into the details of the talk as such, which is on the political economy of labor mobility and the questions of development, and what do we do today while rethinking these questions. So I'll let the floor for Dr. Neha, and we'll be recording this session for other students and others also who would like to benefit from this. Thank you, Dr. Neha, if you could start.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Nayanjoti. And it's really a pleasure to be here for this Ideas webinar organized by the OP Jindal University. I'd like to start by congratulating you on the launch of the new MSc on development practice. And like you said, I think these are interesting times that you're living through. There are a lot of new challenges. And I think there is a requirement to really rethink how we have approached certain traditional questions. So, with the opportunity to understand and question, I think, dominant development paradigms and also try and innovate to respond to persistent challenges and new developments in the world of work. I think I will try and draw upon 20 odd years of my experience of working as a researcher, but also more recently, as you mentioned, working with the ILO to try and understand what workers demand, what are the attitudes of employers to certain questions around labor mobility, and also what are the challenges that governments face, right, in designing really policies around mobility and development. So before I begin, let me just talk a little bit about the structure of my presentation today. I will, of course, be laying out the context and highlight issues related to areas from where vulnerable migrant workers come from. And I think while the context I will be drawing upon is the South Asian context broadly, we can, I think, infer certain commonalities, right, with other areas in the global South as we do so. I will also delve into the questions and lessons, I think, that we have learned around trying to have a better understanding of labor intermediation in the context of growing labor migration. And we will try and see if there's time to delve into the legal and policy framework, right, which looms large, and hopefully we can have a discussion on how to imagine a pro-informal worker politics that is inclusive and democratic in nature. But before I do so, I think let's take a minute to talk a little bit about the terminology and the language that we use when we talk about mobility and development. Now, as we know, I think, the English language in which we are currently conversing has given us a plethora of words, right, that we use when we talk about issues around mobility and development. Migration tends to be a term which is used to connote several things. And the moment you add an affix to it, if you add forced, for example, to migration, the connotation is a very negative connotation in terms of how we see the movement of people from one place to the other. The moment you attach safe to it, it then connotes, the effort to really try and make the process much more smoother and safer for workers. But I think when we look at terms that we use, it's really important to think about how some of these terms in policy have certain connotations which then play out in terms of program design, and the design of schemes and provisions that will actually help migrant workers along the way. But at the same time, I think the negative connotations that we have around unsafe migration, around the issues of trafficking, I think are also important to keep in mind when we try and wrap our mind around some of these challenges. There are also certain, I think, almost oxymorons that we use, right? And we'll delve a little bit more into that when I speak a little bit about labor intermediation, but terms like fair recruitment, for example, right? And this is a pitch that the ILO has to really make recruitment fair and responsible. But given the political economy of how the world works today, is it really possible for recruitment to be fair, and to be safe, right? So I think this is really important to keep in the context of the larger discussion that we will try and have today. And I would now like to talk a little bit about what we see in terms of also state policy, right? When it comes to looking at mobility and development. Now, mobility connotes a positive link with development usually, right? Whether it's economic or otherwise. And while there is an overarching focus on the mobility of capital, and recently so on the restrictions of it, it is the immobility of labor that I'd like to argue that does not receive due attention and is rather invisibilized in our understanding of how development takes place. What we can really see then is the overarching dependence of state policy, which is edificed on the Louisian paradigm, right, which imagines that rural urban migration is inevitable for an industrialization-led development of any country. It is also, based on large data sets, right, which presume the inert inability of the citizen that we are talking about. So if you look at the delivery of social security schemes, you look at how rations are accessed, what we really see is the static individual or the fixed household, right, that receives benefits from the state. But as we can see around us, the levels of labor mobility, the number of people, the sheer number of people who are on the move, whether, by choice or in a forced fashion, we know that there's this huge refugee crisis that is persisting in the Asian context as well, as we see Myanmarese refugees moving to other countries in search of a livelihood, but also to be able to survive, right? I think all these factors are important for us to first start with the understanding that the way in which state policy is made is based on these very large data sets, which do not adequately capture mobility. What we usually have is data on stocks, right? What is present at the moment rather than on flows or the ways in which people move between their home and their workplace in the search of work. And I think, in the background of this, it's important to look at the context then of where very large number of workers come from. So we see a predominance of outbound employment regimes in the global south, which could be countrywide, such as the case of Bangladesh, which actively promotes international migration of their workers. or it could be state specific, right? Where we see in states like Jharkhand or Chhattisgarh, historically, we've seen specific communities have moved or have been moved forcibly to work in other parts of the country, right? But what we do see as a commonality in terms of both these states and the countries or even pockets of high migration, as they're called in India, are that these spaces are where we can see a hyper transition from rural economies to the globalized economy, uh, which is in full swing. In India, we have witnessed how traditional habitats in resource-rich areas are often vacated in order to enable new infrastructures, new investments, and new industries. Similarly, we can also see traditional agriculture, which employs large populations. This is often being replaced by intensive industrial style monoculture agriculture that employs fewer people, right? And leaving a large number of people unemployed. So, unless other local jobs are created for men and for women, these new industries and agricultural practices on their own are really unable to create sufficient jobs to replace the old ones that were characteristic of what we understand as rural livelihoods. Now, depending on the intensity of capital investment processes and the ensuing agrarian crisis, they trigger varying degrees of migration outflows and gendered outcomes of labor mobility. As we see the movement of workers into industries, or overwhelmingly, as we see in the case of the global south, also into services. Now, as political contestation to the lack of jobs and the corresponding need to migrate rises, we see policymakers eventually trying to establish consent seeking mechanisms to ensure that outgoing populations can be sent as migrant workers to other sites of global production with the promise of better opportunities and remittance earning potential for their families. This is where private economic actors requiring low income labor, in distant locations, actually collaborate with local policymakers to collectively pool, acculturate, and prepare workers for their future labor needs outside the district, outside the state, or even outside the country. Now, we can see in recent times, the main targets of these policies are actually women, indigenous communities, and other marginalized communities from low income households across the global south. So we see, what in the Indian scenario, to give a reference to context would be efforts like the Skill India mission, right? Where we see classroom type settings in different types of pre-departure or skilling programs. The challenge with these outbound employment regimes is that the economic and political actors controlling the training spaces share both the economic and political incentives not to highlight decent work deficits in destination areas and not to impart collectively bargained skills that could enable better working conditions. So in effect, these training programs, while offering some technical skills, being based on the assumption, of course, that workers lack skills, right? And they need to be upskilled to be able to perform certain types of jobs, can still end up actually developing subservience to future abusive employment conditions in the name of empowerment or skilling. So to give you an example, I saw as part of the work we did with the ILO in Chhattisgarh, I went to a village where a lot of migration for domestic work, which is seen as a under-regulated sector, it's seen as a sector which has extremely abusive conditions, was very prevalent, right? And to dissuade women from migrating into domestic work, um, there were trainings rolled out to train these women on, surprise, surprise, on sewing, right? Because this is seen as a type of employment that would be amenable to women. So we do essentialize, even as we upskill, what type of work is best suited for which types of workers, right? So what we then see is hundreds of women being trained um, in stitching. And in effect, we see a saturation of the labor market locally, where there are just too many women with stitching skill to be able to then earn a livelihood in a respectable manner. So we then see a huge process of these workers being taken away from Chhattisgarh into garment clusters such as in Bangalore or Tirupur, where they are then involved in garment production and are kept in hostels, not allowed to move out of their dorms, um, in an effort to try and protect them, right? So, what we are really seeing is a certain type of mobility of these workers, but in effect, a lot of the conditions of their work would qualify as forced labor, and really, be tantamount to how we even refer to uh, in terms of traffic victims and the challenges that they face. So, what is really the element of choice, right? In negotiating different forms of mobility and mobility, I think are important to consider. So, coming back to these pre-departure skilling programs, uh, we conducted a review as part of the ILO project that I was associated with. And we realized that the content of training is actually omitting information on working conditions and portraying a rosy picture of possible earnings. A lot of the times, the earnings that workers report finally after having reached the destination and having worked there are seen to be much below minimum wage levels for migrant workers, right? So it is a conundrum that we see where you do have workers coming in from other areas working at lesser wages and really undercutting the struggles of local workers demanding higher wages. And I think the garment sector is one sector in our country that we can see which is plagued by this challenge of dealing with a regular flow of migrant workers, which then actually meets the demands of sort of seasonal fashion production at a global scale. So I think this is important to then consider how recruitment agencies are then linked perhaps to these pre-skilling and pre-departure training exercises that we see. But I think what is really to be underscored here is the fact that migration of workers, especially women workers, depends really on the specific context of patriarchy and how women's mobility, work seeking, and distress then is socially appraised and mediated. So the more women's mobility and work is restricted and socially stigmatized, as it is in large swaths of our country, right, where the ideal place of women, the safest place of women is assumed to be at home, we see that the more women will simply not migrate, or if they're desperate to leave, will migrate suddenly and secretly to avoid stigma, and the constant sort of surveillance of the community and the state. So for those who have never migrated, migrating all of a sudden can be risky, even if staying back is equally undesirable. Now, this undesirability that I'm talking about actually stems from what I feel primarily is the marital status of women in the global south, right? Where depending on what their marital status is, whether they have the choice to move or not move is also negotiated. So, of course, for example, if we look at construction work, we see a lot of women workers, moving with their husbands or their male family members to carry out this work. But we also see overwhelmingly that a lot of widowed, separated, abandoned, divorced women are also migrating for domestic work, precisely because their local communities do not have the capacity to be able to provide decent work opportunities to these women, right? So when it comes again to policy making, I think it's important to understand that we do talk about the stereotypical household, husband, wife, children, grandchildren, etc. But there are so many workers who actually do not fall into that archetypical, right? And to whom also migration policy must respond to, right? So the state must actually make efforts then to respond to, of course, what we see as majority trends, but keeping in mind and making sure that especially vulnerable workers are also protected in the way state policy is designed. So what we then see is an effort to have safe migration programs, right? Where there's an effort to actually educate workers about how to go, where to go, who to be in touch with, etc. But what we have really found is that conventional safe migration interventions um, tend to either prevent migration or promote it, and both can be harmful, right? So on one hand, you have preventive programs which look at the fact that, you know, the safest place for women is at home, and if they migrate, uh, the risk of being exploited, especially in commercial sexual exploitations, are so high that it is better for women to actually find local work opportunities. And if you look at a lot of employment schemes which are designed for women, they do presume that women would like to work close to their homes, right, in an effort to do so. But the other side is that you have, the promotion of migration. And again, this could also be problematic because we do know the conditions that prevail in the informal economy, right? And in these conditions, we can understand that whatever messages you give, whatever information you give to women about making it safe, there are so many other, I think, conditions and factors that could really play out in making that migration journey risky or unavoidable, is again something to really keep in mind. Sorry. And I think, so then we have these two approaches to migration. You have the anti-trafficking set, right, which is talking about strong anti-trafficking bills, which talks about criminalizing intermediation, criminalizing agents who help workers actually find jobs. And again, I think, one can't um, actually paint a brush where we color all recruitment agents in the same color, right? Where we paint them all in the same light. There's a mix of people. I think there are lots of unscrupulous agents, but there are also, I think, well-meaning intermediaries that women workers depend on to be able to access work. So it's important to understand that when we get into intermediation, I think you have a lot of intermediation which takes place, especially if you have limited access to decent work opportunities, which is the case in the global south as we see it, right? So the more we have, the higher the demand, the more the intermediation will be. And I think, we can see how labor outsourcing and subcontracting policies have really tended to blur the responsibilities of employers and labor intermediaries, as well as with governments, to ensure fair recruitment and decent work access. So there are four things that we can see taking place. One, we can see private employers delinking themselves from the direct responsibility of recruiting and contracting. The more distant they are, the more they can actually escape the responsibility of providing decent working conditions. We have labor intermediaries, which then dealing themselves from working conditions, because the idea is that it's the employer's responsibility to provide decent working conditions, and the intermediary is only trying to connect the worker with the employer, right? So ensuring that decent work is available is not the responsibility of the labor intermediary. We also see the setting of working conditions by default or by design in a bubble that is kept somewhat isolated from state regulation. Now, I think if we see the extent of informalization, right, that exists in the economy, we can see that a lot of production takes place in small enterprises which are under-regulated by the government. There have been recent efforts in India to do so, but a lot needs to still be done. We can also see that certain workplaces are not regulated at all, such as the private household, right? And this has again been a demand of trade unions for a very long time to bring in a bill to protect domestic workers so that the household as a workplace is recognized. And fourthly, we see the further complication of the sidelining of public employment offices in the favor of private employment and recruitment agencies, right? So what used to be a demand of workers to really have employment exchanges is slowly being seen as, the focus of the state has really been to promote private recruitment. Now, again, I think there are certain efforts being made in terms of the national career portal that we have in India, for example. but really, how effective it is in reaching out to the most vulnerable of workers who really need the work and are desperate to work under any condition is the real question to then ask, right? So I think the principal employer's responsibility here, which is the employer, we can't ignore that. And I think in all these efforts to clean up recruitment and clean up intermediation, which is still being, I think, carried out on the international level, because migration is actually, I think, a much more tricky terrain um, to govern, right? When it's a question of sovereign authority, which sort of inhibits certain laws from being put into place. What we can also then see at the internal level is certain similar processes taking place. So, it's sometimes it's ironic to see how, for example, the government of India is demanding better working conditions, rightly so, for workers who have been placed abroad, working in different countries, right? But at the same time, I mean, for the same types of work within the country, these workers don't have many avenues, right, where they can reach out to the government and request them to really intervene or safeguard their interests. So if working conditions are poor, what we see is that each stakeholder in the recruitment process has a vested interest in not volunteering information that could make the migrant worker change their mind. The more intermediaries are involved in the recruitment process, the more likely it is that they will omit information, if not outright misinform migrant workers about working conditions. This leads many workers to claim that they were deceived during the recruitment process, right? And yet, each individual link in the chain is often able to plausibly deny this charge. So even when we look at trafficking cases, right, we see that um, because there are so many links in the chain, and sometimes, I think the lower level intermediaries are actually being very truthful about not knowing what the working conditions are like. We really see then a criminalized response, targeting these local intermediaries rather than being able to clean up the process of recruitment at a larger scale, right? And this, again, I think is a very under-researched area, as we also found in the ILO, because there is a lot of work now being done on the challenges that migrant workers face in the destinations that they are, this sector-specific work, but really how the worker reaches the particular workplace, right, or reaches at that point, is really critical, because the establishment of a formal contract, of terms and conditions of work, of employment, of the access to social security is all something that can be, I think, dealt with effectively if we really look at the intermediation process carefully. So what we then see is the static subject of this of which is a citizen, right, who is wanting work, and if he is not already migrated to the city, is then being targeted by placement agencies, recruiters, trainers to fit into the Louisian frame of development that is promoted worldwide. Now, another, I think, interesting aspect, which I sort of touched upon, was the fact that when it comes to vulnerable workers, they do depend a lot on informal intermediation, right? So the question really is, how do you how do you not throw the baby out with the bathwater here? Because how do you allow for informal intermediation? Because workers, in their experiences, during successive cycles of migration, are actually able to find out, a better place of work, better ways of bargaining, and then transfer this knowledge to workers, right? So the trade union setup then becomes essential to be able to enable migrant workers to access such information, to access better forms of work, right, in the migration journeys that they undertake. And I think the legal apparatus that we have in place right now does not effectively allow um, for positive intermediation to really take place. And what does the state do then, right? It promotes fair or ethical recruitment policies, um, where they basically try, there's this creation of non-binding codes of conduct. And I think the ILO has tried very hard to actually come up with conventions, and we have conventions that are applicable for placement agencies, where they're supposed to represent, the interests of workers as well as of employers. But usually we see the workers' interest, being undermined or neglected in the practice of intermediation, right? But I think what is important is for the state to really play the leading role. And again, I think it's interesting to see how, for example, in the migration of domestic work, there are state-run recruitment agencies that are involved in placing domestic workers internationally, whereas you don't have a proactive step being taken by the state in doing the same for domestic workers within the country, right? So I think state regulation in recruitment can, or state presence in recruitment can really set the bar in terms of a good practice which can be followed, or a standard that needs to be adhered to by private and public recruitment players in the labor market. Okay, so with this, I'm now going to take a little bit of time to talk about, I think, the legal frameworks that we have available. And I think before I launch into the labor codes, I think, which is of great importance in the discussion we have today, I think it's important to also use a minute to reflect on COVID, right? And I think a lot of migration scholars were already talking about how social protection is inaccessible for migrant workers, precisely because of the idea that there's a fixed citizen that receives or can access social security. And we saw that during COVID, how there were millions of workers stranded, not just in India, but across the world, trying to get back, right? But not being on the radar at all. There were no data sets that captured the magnitude of workers that were in distress during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think, again, the fact where workers were organized, the fact where trade unions did have access to workers in their workplaces, workers were marginally better off than workers who had no access at all, right? And which is why, again, the importance of having workers' representatives in place, having spaces where workers can visibilize themselves as migrant workers, as workers who are essential to production and to service provisioning in several economies across the world is really, really important. Now, what we also see playing out in terms of the control of mobility and immobility of work and workers um, is really the fact that I think the notion that freedom of association and collective bargaining is only going to create a problem in terms of local workers not being able to access their rights. And I think this again is a myth that needs to be dispelled because traditional trade union organizing still tends to focus on local workers in a large part. But what we're really seeing is several industries and several sectors now being dependent on migrant workers, precisely perhaps because of the strong trade union movements that have existed in certain parts of the world and within this country. But how do we, going forward, really think of ways in which we can look at decent wages, decent working conditions for migrants and non-migrant workers alike is really the challenge. And I think for us at the ILO, when I was working there, I think it was really interesting to see how we promoted worker centers rather than isolating migrant workers via migrant resource centers, which has been, really the trend that has picked up post-COVID, right? So to have a worker center where workers in duress or workers needing any sort of help can access help is really, really essential. And this, again, in the context of special production zones, SEZs that we have, I think should really be made mandatory and should be a demand that we all rally behind so that we can visibilize these workers and try and bring them together under the rubric of trade unions or under the rubric of state policy, which then gives equal access. And this is again across the board because we can see, for example, even within India, migrant workers being paid much lesser than local workers. And this is the same fate that Indian workers meet when they migrate to countries in West Asia, for example, where the local minimum wages are significantly higher than what is legally mandated for migrant workers in those sectors. Okay, now coming to labor codes, and I think I've already gone over my half an hour promise, but very quickly to talk a little bit about that. I think in principle, and this is again, coming from my experience of working with the ILO, codification is not, it's not a bad idea, right? Codification really means simplifying labor laws so that they are equally applicable to all, right? And the idea of codification should have been that if we have conditions of work which have been legally regulated in terms of formal work, right, or formalized work, the idea would have been to bridge the gap between informal workers and formal workers by bringing up informal workers to the level of formal workers in the country. On the contrary, what we are seeing is, you know, formal workers being brought closer to the situation of informal workers via the codification process that has unfolded over the last few years. The codes were passed in Parliament without a discussion. I think, given the fact that they are going to impact so many millions of workers in a country as large as ours, at least a democratic discussion, I think, would have been valuable to be able to really suss out and see what could be added to protect vulnerable workers much more. And the fact that that opportunity was lost is really, I think, something that I think the whole labor movement that we've seen in this country, it's been a big setback to it. I'm not going to go into the details of the codes, but the fact remains that the wage code was promising recognition to a lot of workers. Workers like domestic workers were supposed to be included in the wage code. This would have also led to better wages being available across regions within the country. We are still waiting to see what the wage committee is going to suggest and what the government will finally accept, right? But the idea that equal wages, minimum wages will be implemented for all workers is a hope that these codes did hold. A big, I think, criticism that has come from trade union constituents is the fact that several workers who work in smaller enterprises or in private households are not under the purview of the law yet. Because if you look at the occupational safety and working conditions code, enterprises have been deemed as those having 10 workers or more. And a lot of informal work is actually taking place in production sites or households which employ less than 10 workers, right? Even in terms of social security access, we have the eShram, which has been rolled out. And I think this is going to be one of the largest social protection databases as we see, because I think the latest data points to the fact that, I think construction work is the highest number of workers that have been enrolled, but domestic work significantly, which didn't have any concrete data or government tests that have enrolled under eShram, which will then be brought under the Social Security Code. What kind of schemes will they really have? There is a small old age pension, there is a accident benefit scheme, there is a death insurance scheme. But what else? Are we really going to move beyond the welfare board model, right? Which basically tries to promote some top-down benefit to be given to workers who are especially vulnerable, and try and really create a comprehensive social protection system that is adequate to meet the needs of workers. I think this really is a question that remains to be answered and remains to be seen. Let me end there, and thank you for your attention to all that I have shared today. And I hope we can, unpack some more of this in the Q&A that will follow. Thank you, Nanjoti. All over to you.
Thank you, Neha. That was very nice. It was a lot of issues actually around the question of mobility and and labor. So I would like to open up to any questions that we might have from the faculty and students that we have here. Before that, I'd like to ask something. Before that, the because you mentioned a number of law, the legal clauses and so on. So the uh, there's a bill on the employment, what do you call, the Migration Act, 1979, I think, no? The Interstate Migration Act. So would that fall in the similar category of kind of invisibilizing the migration aspect of it? Because that, as far as I remember, also talks about uh, the displacement from the origin, and then it does talk about, yeah, I mean, the migration pattern itself. So so on one hand, probably that will also collapse into one of the codes right now. But does that need revision and something in the codes themselves is was one. The other is like you mentioned on the positive intermediation, and so if you could elaborate just a little bit on that. Uh, the and the last is, I mean, the COVID we all remember. I mean, migrant workers on the streets. I mean, I remember the Mr. Solicitor General talking about there being actually no, I think there was a figure of like 4 crores that he quoted who had migrated to the cities for work, and then were migrating back. And then he gave a figure in the Supreme Court saying that there are only 6,60,000 workers left who are all in the shelters. And so there is basically nobody on the, so it was out on your face how invisibilization can happen, because everybody was seeing what was happening. And then the what very confidently the government data quoting was that this section just does not exist. uh, and that kind of probably continues in policy as well right now. So I just yeah, so these two, and then uh, I think we can maybe take other questions as well, and then you can go on. Okay, if there is anybody else. Hi, yeah, Gayatri, please go ahead.
Hi Neha, thank you so much. And like I had to ask something very specific because you have been within so many of these spaces which is inaccessible from elsewhere. Also, attached to each one is the domestic worker survey the government is undertaking, and I would be very glad to know if you know anything more about it because if they're actually doing it, it's a huge thing that's happening. Just that.
Thank you. If there are no other questions, then you can
Yeah, shall I start with this set? And then maybe if there are other thoughts, we can
yes.
come back to it. Thanks so much, Nayan, for your questions, and Gayatri as well. Good to see you, Gayatri. Okay, let me begin by responding to the question that Nayan Jyoti has raised. The Interstate Migrant Workers Act. Okay, so I think when the labor codes were announced, this was the concern, right? That there has been so much of work that has gone into developing laws and successive amendments, right? Especially if you look at the Construction Workers Act. A lot of these laws have also have gone through or have been accompanied by a legal process, where certain things have been challenged in court, and then the court has then, asked the government to ensure that the laws actually cover the aspects that were not earlier covered on, right? So there's a long history of this process. And it was a concern as to whether, with the stroke, with one brush stroke and bringing these labor codes in, is everything going to be now not applicable anymore? So I think one of the responses of the government has been, of course, that all other laws stay. But then the labor codes, of course, are much more, I think, recent. And there's also political will to implement the labor codes in letter and spirit. Now, the government having waited for states to enact rules also is a process where, given that labor is a concurrent is in the concurrent list, right? It's providing the space for states to prioritize which areas, which sectors they would like to ensure are covered under these new labor codes. But again, I think the general understanding feedback from workers' representatives have been that even the state rules are unfortunately not covering many of these aspects. Um, I think after the rules are notified, there could be efforts to really go back to the 1979 Act, Nayan. And I think the 1979 Act, even though it has, I think, several drawbacks, um, there are some positives in the act as well, right? Which talks about the process, for example, through which migrant workers who have not had access to their rights can actually be enabled, right, to do so. But the current codes actually are even going to dismantle the kind of processes that are in place for intermediation, for adjudication, etc. So we really don't know. It's a space that we're going to tread and find out as really time goes by. There was some discussion on a fifth code that civil society and trade unions wanted to move. But again, I mean, how much about this country and the labor laws that have been evolved can you really summarize in the matter of 4, 5, 6 codes is really the question, right? So should the codes have focused on specific areas and gone hand in hand with sector-specific regulation, especially to protect vulnerable workers? I would say yes. Whether it will be able to do so or not, I mean, that again, I think time will tell. On positive intermediation, I think, you know, asking the state to step in to the intermediation process has its risks and benefits. If you look at, the anti-human trafficking units that have been set up, there is actually increased surveillance at the community level to ensure that women are not trafficked. Now, if women want to willingly enter sex work, as many sex workers have also reported that, sex work is better paying than many other sectors of work. How does one negotiate this community surveillance, right, without running away? So it's a really tricky question sometimes to also ask the state to intervene too much in the intermediation process. So to my mind, I think positive intermediation would be worker-led. I think there are ways in which trade unions have also engaged with the placement process. We've seen a very successful model that has been experimented with by SEVA in the state of Kerala, right, where they've been able to actually increase wages of domestic workers during times of COVID, right, when live-in workers were much more in demand. And when again the lockdowns ended and the demand for live-in workers waned, it waned, we actually saw how SEVA negotiated a higher wage for live-out domestic workers or part-time domestic workers. So I think there are ways in which this can be done. There are obviously also risks, right? Because things can go wrong. But I think the safety net that we have, if we have workers involved in the intermediation process, those who've experienced it themselves, those who have workers' interests at heart, I think we can actually create a model which would be much more successful and pro-worker in the long run. On COVID-19, very quickly, I think, this is again, I mean, I was involved in a process where the Ministry of External Affairs was trying to actually gauge how many workers are abroad, right? There was actually no data on this. And so we actually had to bring together recruitment agencies, private recruitment agencies, into a conversation to try and create guesstimates of what we are going to see, right, when the repatriation process takes place. And I think this realization led to now much more robust data being collected on who is exiting the country for work and who is coming back after having been employed overseas, right? So the Bureau of Immigration now, if you notice, is collecting the type of visa that you have gone out on when you come back into the country as well. This data was not collected earlier, pre-COVID. So again, we have now some new forms of data which can be used. But having said that, I think even in terms of what the government of Jharkhand encountered, I think is a lesson to really take away from. They actually created a helpline, and I think they had one of the best systems in place to respond to workers who were in need of repatriation, right? And they really helped. They transferred money into workers' accounts. They helped get them tickets. They helped quarantine them, bring them back home, etc., etc. But when we start looking at the data, which upon request, I think the Labor Department did try and glean through, it was interesting to note that most of the beneficiaries of this helpline were actually workers from upper castes. They were mostly men, right? And they also belong to sectors which were much better regulated than the sectors where we find large numbers of vulnerable Jharkhandi workers employed in, right? So again, I think unless we start thinking of flows, capturing flows much more effectively, unless we also supplant, I think, qualitative and ethnographic methods, right, on top of quantitative data sets, the real picture is really going to be missing. And I think, for me, because I've been working on domestic workers migrating from Southwest Jharkhand, this is a question which I asked the Labor Department: were there domestic workers who actually accessed this helpline? And the response was no, right? So really, are the policies that we have, are the schemes that we have, are they being able to reach out to the most vulnerable? I think that should be the starting point before when we really think about policy formulation or designing a scheme that could help workers. And Gayatri, to your question on the domestic worker survey, I think the domestic worker survey has also been a casualty of COVID-19, right? Because this is again something that I personally had also been following up to see if there had been progress on it. Initially, and if you look at certain Press Information Bureau releases or questions that were answered in the parliament on the domestic worker survey, the government has been claiming that the survey is underway, the data has been collected, etc., etc. But of late, there has been silence on the domestic worker survey, where I think again it's a big question mark whether the data exists, and again whether the veracity of the data once it's been checked, whether it will stand by with what the government really wants to propose and do, right? I think the sort of the interesting part is that because of e-shram enrollment, now that you have such large numbers, right? Do we really need the domestic worker survey uh, to estimate the number of workers that are employed in this sector? Perhaps not, right? We still don't have a breakup of live-in versus live-out workers, of the nuances, right, that could have been captured through the domestic worker survey. So the data, I think, is extremely valuable if it is ever released. But again, as we have seen in the last 10 odd years, what data is released, what data is collected is really not sort of in line with the labor standards and the conventions that India is signatory to, right? But the situation stands as it is. So I'm also very keen to check and know more about the domestic worker survey. And if I hear more, I will definitely let you know, right? Thanks.
Thank you, Neha. Are there any other questions? Otherwise, we are also past four. So we would. So if there are no other questions at this point, we will just close this session. It was good actually. It was very focused as well as comprehensive on the specific topic. So we would like to hopefully continue the conversation. And it has been great also because I mean there is faculty involved. We are as one of our, for example, in the course that we were talking about, we also have a concentration on labor and development, uh, which we trying to develop as a concentration in itself with different kind of courses and so on. So in that specifically, and otherwise also, we hope to keep in touch with you. And since we will be having our classes and so on in from August in Delhi. Uh, so it will be great to have you as a resource person or something, and you can think about it of some kind of an engagement there as well, which would benefit us for sure. So thank you so much for your time, Neha, and yeah,
Yeah, thanks, man. I think it's really been, a good opportunity for me also to reflect on some of the takeaways, from the work I've done. And again, like you said, I think the MSc in development practice promises to be, I think, a great way in which I think OP Jindal and ideas can really promote new approaches to some of these old questions. And I'll be really happy to contribute in whichever way I can to the exercise. So I do think, policy needs a lot of exhaustive research to feed into it. And I do see the ideas cluster really being able to contribute to that cause in the near future. So, with best wishes on this endeavor and looking forward to collaborations. Thank you again for this opportunity to speak.
thank, thank you, Neha. Thank you, everyone. See you.